Okay, according to my clock here, we are right at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started, and certainly look forward to other people joining in as they are able. Thank you once again for joining us for this next edition in our Tartan Talks webinar series. This afternoon, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Brianna Harfmann, Elma College 2011 graduate and assistant professor of integrative physiology and health science here. And she's going to be talking about circadian rhythms, or our body clocks. And it's going to be an interesting session, and I'm very excited to have her. Just want to give a reminder that we will be keeping microphones muted throughout the session, just to help keep the background noise to a minimum. We do have a text chat feature in the Zoom platform. If you scroll across your screen, you're going to see a menu pop up at the bottom that should have a few items, and one would say chat, and it has sort of a little talk or thought bubble. If you click on that, another small window should open on your screen if you're using your computer or tablet. And you can enter a text message there that you can post to the entire group or send just to me individually. And I will be presenting those questions to Dr. Harfmann as we go through the session or at the end, depending on how things are going at the time, and we'll interject those questions. Again, so we were going to get started. Just a reminder that we are recording this session, and we will make the recording available to all participants after we're able to clean up the recording a little bit and get it put in appropriate format. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Harfmann. Brianna, thank you for joining us, and it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction and for the invitation to talk today to the group. And I also appreciate everyone who has joined us today for this discussion. I want to start out by talking a little bit about what we're going to cover in today's talk. So we're going to be discussing circadian rhythms, which is my field of research and what I was trained in. And I'm hoping that throughout this talk, I will give you a better understanding of what circadian rhythms are. Typically, people, when we think about circadian rhythms, including myself, think about sleep-wake cycles initially. And sleep-wake cycles are, in fact, circadian. They do oscillate over a 24-hour cycle to match our day. But there are a lot of other processes within the human body that also oscillate. And they're critical for helping us match our body's process to our environmental cues. So we're going to talk about a few of those circadian processes, as well as why they're so important. And anytime you have a rhythm, you have some kind of mechanism to keep time. And so for us, we're going to have some body clocks. So we're going to talk about how those clocks are set and give a short introduction into what different setting factors are, including entrainment factors. And when you have a clock, you know that to set a clock, you have to know what time that clock initially is at. And so for our bodies, that could be defined as our chronotype. So whether someone likes to wake up early or late. So we're going to discuss different chronotypes, how we define those chronotypes, and then the interaction between chronotypes and our individual schedules or work week. So I'm going to start by talking about what circadian rhythms are. So circadian rhythms are defined as approximately 24-hour oscillations in physiological and behavioral processes. Now we can see an example of a circadian rhythm in this graph down in the lower right-hand corner. And I'm going to bring my laser pointer out, where we can see body temperature cycle. And this is core body temperature. And what we see in this graph is that on the x-axis, we have our time, and it's a 24-hour clock here because we use 24-hour cycles for our timing, our military time really, to discuss our rhythms in order to get at the difference between night and day. So we have a couple different days depicted on this graph. And then we have body temperature on the y-axis. And you can see that for core body temperature, you actually have a drop in core body temperature throughout the night to where we get a trough in body temperature towards the end of the night. And then during the day or the light cycle, and you'll hear me use light cycle and daytime interchangeably throughout this talk. In the day, we have an increase in temperature cycle with a short decrease there, but an overall general trend towards increasing to a peak towards the end of the day. And this pattern, this oscillation, repeats itself from day to day. Temperature I wanted to bring up because this is actually one of the ways that we measure circadian rhythms in humans. You can measure body temperature over time of day and get a snapshot of what an individual's circadian rhythm looks like. If we talk about behavioral processes, we might be talking about things like activity cycles, activity rhythms, or feeding rhythms. If you wear an activity tracker, like what Dr. Montoy talked about in the last lecture of the series, you could wear it over the entire day and look at your activity patterns. And what you should see is that you have an increase in activity during the light phase and a decrease in activity during the dark phase. And that should hold true with food as well. People eat when they're awake during the day and stop eating when they're asleep at night. And we also have a couple of physiological rhythms, including heart rate and blood pressure. So heart rate, if you've ever measured your pulse over time of day, or if you want to try it, you can take your pulse in the morning, late morning, early afternoon, late afternoon, etc. And you should see a trend for your heart rate to increase during the day to where it peaks in the afternoon, and then will start to drop again in the evening. And that holds true for blood pressure as well. Now, these rhythms allow our body to anticipate environmental changes. So we know that we're active during the day. And so for heart rate, it's important that our heart rate is higher during the daytime when we're awake, when we are active. So that way we can pump blood and oxygen and nutrients to the tissues of our body that are active. One of my other favorite examples of talking about a rhythm anticipating environmental changes is actually the change in energy, the change in substrate utilization over time of day. And what I mean by substrate utilization is switching from using carbohydrates or sugars like glucose to using more fats for energy. During the daytime, we actually use more carbohydrates, more sugars for energy, but at night we shift towards that fat metabolism, and that is because the brain is reliant on sugars. The brain can't use fats or proteins as an energy source. And so the body anticipates the fact that we are going to have less food intake at night. There'll be less glucose available. So most of the tissues actually shift towards a fat metabolism in order to spare the glucose or the carbohydrates that are there for the brain. Now, another really important thing that defines circadian rhythms is that they are endogenous, and that means that they are generated by our body. They're an internal mechanism. One of the best studies, I think, to demonstrate the endogenous nature of our circadian rhythms is actually the Mammoth Cave study that was done in 1938. So in this study, Nathaniel Kleitman was a researcher and Bruce Richardson was his student, and they decided to go down about 140 feet into Mammoth Caves and live there for 32 days straight. Now, at about 140 feet deep, there's no natural light. So they're not experiencing any light cues, the light during the day, the dark at night, to tell them what time of day it is. It also was about a constant 54 degrees Fahrenheit at that depth. And so they're not experiencing that temperature cue either, where there's a slight increase in temperature generally in the day and a drop at night. And so their external cues are gone. And what they did was they used body temperature to measure their circadian rhythms. They measured body temperature while they were down in these caves, while they were living there, and then tried to evaluate whether those rhythms were sustained without the external cues. And what they found was that despite the fact that their external cues, the light, the temperature, were not there, they still maintained rhythms, and those rhythms were still approximately 24 hours long. So this demonstrates that our rhythms are produced within the body, that they're not produced by external cues. Our external cues are critical for adjusting or for influencing our rhythms, but we don't need them to stay rhythmic. So if our rhythms are produced within the body, we have to have some kind of clock. And it turns out we do have circadian clocks distributed throughout the entire body in every cell type. And this next slide is probably the most complicated slide of this lecture. It gets more into the nitty-gritty of the cellular basis of rhythms. Now, it's not critical that you memorize all of the genes in this slide and how they interact with each other, But I did want to show this so that you can understand how the clock is generated. You can see a cyclical mechanism, and then I can show you the oscillations, how they are produced, because those oscillations will come back in the further sections of the lecture, of this presentation. So if we're looking at this slide, what we have is we have a cell right here in this blue area. And the dark blue is really the cytoplasm of the cell. And the light blue is the nucleus. And the nucleus is where we house all the genetic information. So our circadian clocks are genetically programmed in our bodies. We have genes that determine our circadian timing. I'm going to mention just 4 of these genes. We have BMAL1, we have clock, period, and cryptochrome. And what we're starting with here is within the nucleus, we have BMAL and clock as proteins, and BMAL and clock will actually act positively on period and cryptochrome to increase their expression. So when you have the presence of BMAL and clock, you will get the presence of period and cryptochrome. Period and cryptochrome are negative influencers though. And so once you have period and cryptochrome, they actually come back and inhibit BMAL and clock. So BMAL and clock no longer goes and expresses period and cryptochrome. What you end up getting are oscillations like this. So if you think about this oscillation in terms of BMAL1 clock activity, they were active, and as they were active, they were causing period and cryptochrome to be expressed. And then period and cryptochrome brought the activity levels back down. And that oscillation will continue. And you get these oscillations over a number of days that last about 24 hours. Now, as I mentioned, these genes, this clock, exists in every cell of the body. And we can see a slight demonstration of this here with this figure. It's called the mammalian molecular clock, and there are some shown. We have one in the brain. You can see there's one shown with the thyroid here, with the skeletal muscle, which would be like your biceps or your triceps or your quads. The endocrine pancreas, which is the part of the pancreas responsible for making insulin, and then skin. And we can further break down these clocks to master clocks and peripheral clocks. So the brain clock, and actually the SCN, which is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it exists within the hypothalamus of the brain, and this clock has been termed the master clock. And then all other clocks in every other cell of the body are called peripheral clocks. Now, the master clock was identified as such because they found that it coordinated other clocks in the body with each other so that they were timed together. And it also helps synchronize those clocks to the external environment. So what you can see here in each of these diagrams is that we see oscillations like we saw in the previous slide. They have clocks, they have these 24-hour oscillations. Now they found that the SCN, or this master clock, got light input from the environment and then could send signals, either hormones or nervous system cues, nervous system signaling, to these cells to then set them to the correct time. Now, we still call the SCN the master clock, but one interesting fact is that recent literature has started to discover that some of these peripheral clocks, like skeletal muscle, actually influence other peripheral clocks as well, and may even potentially feed back to the master clock. We're not going to talk about it today, but there is a new study out that shows the skeletal muscle clocks, so those clocks in your biceps and your triceps, might actually get input from exercise and help, not just from exercise, actually food as well, but then help reset the master clock and then affect your sleep-wake cycles. So this is all very, very recent discoveries. Now, these clocks can be entrained to the environment by entrainment factors like the light that I just talked about that feeds into that master clock. That helps synchronize them to that external environment. And so here I have a mouse depicted, but this could be a human as well. And I've put some clocks on different organs of the body just to get at the idea that we have clocks in every cell of the body. Now, light is the predominant light factor, or the predominant entrainment factor, which just means that as of now, it seems to be the factor that influences our circadian rhythms the most. But we also have other factors like food and activity that are not just rhythmic themselves, but when you time them can actually influence what your clocks are set at. And they can go through different pathways. So for instance, light is typically picked up by photosensitive cells within the eye. And that light cue goes to the master clock in the brain, and the brain then sets all of these other clocks. One interesting fact I'll just kind of point out is that those photosensitive cells are distinct from the cells of the eye that allow you to see, that allow vision. And so they've done some studies with individuals who are blind, and they still actually respond to light cues in terms of their circadian rhythm. So those photosensitive cells still do work. We also have food, which feeds into clocks, potentially in the brain, but we've seen it feeds into clocks in the skeletal muscle, in your liver, in your fat cells. And then activity, which may be setting your rhythms through your skeletal muscle or your brain clock as well. Just to show an example of this with a study, this particular study looked at whether or not exercise could effectively entrain your circadian rhythms. And so I'm going to explain what this graph means. But what we're looking at here is the x-axis. It says Zeitgeber time. We have a German term here. It's just giving you that 24-hour clock. And we're just going to think about it in terms of the 24-hour clock for now. And then on the y-axis, we have plasma melatonin, which I told you earlier, temperature is a way to measure circadian rhythms. Melatonin is also a way to measure your circadian rhythms because it will oscillate in the blood throughout the day. And so you can measure melatonin levels to see when your circadian rhythms are occurring. So this study, they brought participants in and they got their initial circadian rhythms by measuring that melatonin, which we can see in these open white circles. And what you see with this figure is that they're peaking around hour 20. Then they had these individuals exercise a few hours earlier than they normally would for 6 days straight and measured those melatonin levels at the end of the 6 days. Then they tried to keep all other things constant. So their light cycles, their feeding cycles, so exercise was the only thing changing. And what you can see in the black dots is we do have a leftward shift of this curve. And so the peak now occurs around 13 or 14 instead of 20. And so exercise did effectively shift the clock earlier. Now, it is important that we use these entrainment factors, that our body is entrained, so that it is synchronized to our environment and can carry out that critical function of helping our bodies anticipate the environment, the environmental changes. If our clocks are offset from our environment, or for some reason we lose our rhythms, we are in a state of circadian disruption, which is very detrimental to health. I'm just going to list a few of the consequences of circadian rhythm disruption, but disruption has been linked to a plethora of different diseases. But to give you a snapshot, a glimpse at some of these, disruption has been linked to mental health issues, so depression, and that's whether you have weakened rhythms or complete loss of rhythms. Both are linked to depression. Disruption is linked to pulmonary embolism. It's linked to myocardial infarction, which is actually a very interesting one. This is heart attacks right here. And these typically occur in the early morning, so there is some rhythm to heart attacks themselves. It's linked to cancer. They've done studies where they have knocked out the clock in certain animal species, and they are much more prone to developing cancer. And it's linked to obesity and diabetes, so metabolic disorders. Now, what are some ways that we can actually disrupt our rhythms? When do they become disrupted? So two very common examples are jet lag and shift work. And you probably have heard of these before, but we can talk about them a little bit more in detail and start with jet lag. So with jet lag, you're talking about traveling to an area of the world that has a different time zone or a different light cycle than where you are originating from or you are currently living. When this happens, you end up in a time zone that your cues, your external environment, is actually different from your internal clock. And unlike your typical alarm clock or the clock at work or in your hallway, you can't just take the clock off the wall and quickly reset it within a matter of seconds. It actually takes days to weeks to reset your rhythm, depending on how far you're traveling and actually your age as well. Younger individuals typically reset their clocks much easier than older individuals. Now, another example of this is shift work. So anyone who is working on a shift that is different from their endogenous, their internal circadian rhythm. So a great example of this is night shift nurses. So these individuals typically work 3 days a week from maybe 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. So 3 days out of the 7 days of the week, they are active, they are eating, moving around in the dark phase, and then trying to sleep during the light phase. Now, if they try to maintain that same schedule all 7 days, they're still going to have at least weakened circadian rhythms because their light cues are telling them it's day when their body is trying to now go to sleep and tell them it's night. If they try to shift their schedule from day to day and they work 3 days a week at night and the other 4 days of the week they go back to a normal day schedule, it's even worse for their rhythms. Generally, that causes complete arrhythmia, where they lose their rhythms altogether. And both of these conditions put people at significantly higher risk for developing those diseases that I mentioned on the slide before. Now, one newer condition, this was a term coined more recently by a man named Till Roneberg in Munich, is social jet lag. So this is like jet lag in that you're shifting your rhythms by maybe a few hours, but instead of being due to travel, we have a shift in our rhythms due to changes in sleep because of social cues. So this could be a college student who's waking up at 8 a.m. for a class Monday through Friday, but then on the weekends is staying up late and sleeping in. This could be someone who has a night owl tendency, but has early times for work during the Monday through Friday week. And if you think about it, that means they're shifting their schedule every Friday to Saturday and every Sunday to Monday. And I told you that shift doesn't happen in just one day. So it is pretty hard on the circadian rhythm system to do that back and forth shift constantly or chronically. This does lead to weakened or disrupted rhythms. Now, this also does depend on the timing of your individual clock, which I kind of mentioned, that night owl timing. So how your chronotype lines up with your work week can influence how much social jet lag you experience. So what is our chronotype? Well, chronotype can be defined simply by a preference for sleep time. So some people like to go to sleep early, wake up early. Some people like to go to sleep late and wake up late. We have the terms in general culture of lark, night owl, early bird, night owl, but chronotype has been better defined by recent research. Now, they have decided to base chronotype on the middle of your sleep. And they did this because people actually have preferences for sleep time. Some people need 8 hours of sleep, some people need 5 hours of sleep, and some like 10. And so instead of having to deal with the differences in preference for sleep time, they're just looking at when's the middle of your sleep schedule. So for example, if you have someone that goes to bed at midnight and wakes up at 8 a.m., they would be a mid-sleep of 4 a.m. And so their chronotype would be a 4 a.m. chronotype. And we can see that depicted on this graph here. This shows just our different chronotypes. And again, they're doing the 8-hour schedule just to make it simple. So you can see this would be 12 o'clock as 0, because that's midnight, and 8 a.m. So this would be your 4 o'clock chronotype from the example before. And so they've taken all of the different chronotypes, they've assigned labels to them, so extreme early chronotype, moderate early, slight early, normal, and so forth. And then they've actually looked at the population and where people fall. See, most people fall in this slight early to normal range. And you can look at where you fall if you want to do that by thinking about what your normal sleep schedule is on a day when you don't have to wake up for anything and you don't use an alarm clock. When would you go to sleep? When would you wake up? And find the middle of that sleep, and you can place yourself on this graph. Then they took this further and they actually looked at how much social jet lag an individual might experience based on what chronotype they would be. And you can see that on this graph. On the x-axis, we have chronotype. So again, you can see that individual from our example who has a chronotype of 4 would fall here. And then we've plotted social jet lag in hours. So how many hours are they shifting themselves from Friday to Saturday and then Sunday to Monday, from week to week, because of their chronotype? And people who have a chronotype of 4 typically experience at least 1 hour of shift of social jet lag every week, which may not seem like a lot, but again, when you're doing this chronically, it is hard on your circadian system and does put you at higher risk for development of those diseases, as well as can make you have that typical jet lag feeling of feeling groggy and energyless, lethargic. So how can we reset our clocks to potentially move us from maybe a night owl to a chronotype that fits with our work schedule? Because we can shift our chronotypes with our entrainment factors. Now they are somewhat, we're finding, genetically programmed, but even with the genetics that program your clock to work at a certain time, you can effectively use light, food, exercise to reset that clock so you can minimize the amount of social jet lag you experience. Now I have some tips listed here, but there are a lot of different things you can do. One thing you'll notice with these tips is that there's kind of a theme with those entrainment factors we talked about, with light, with feeding, with exercise. So some things that you can do is you can eat soon after you wake up. If you can give yourself that food cue right away, early in the morning, that helps tell your body, okay, you need to be awake, you need to be active. Now, I probably shouldn't mention this, but there was a study a few years back where they took rats in a lab and they gave them dark chocolate in the morning, and they found that dark chocolate was actually quite effective at reprogramming their rhythms. It had to be over 70% dark chocolate, though. You can also move your dinner earlier and try not to eat later in the evenings. My mentor in graduate school, the person I really started learning circadian rhythms from, did not eat after 8 o'clock because she felt eating in that dark phase, eating too late, was going to delay her rhythms. And there have been studies that show that if you eat very late, if you eat when it's dark, you start to move your rhythms back towards that late rhythm. You can exercise earlier in the day. I know there are studies out there that show that exercising in the evening can help you get a better quality of sleep. But in terms of circadian rhythms, exercising early in the day, in the morning, in the late morning, early afternoon is going to be much better for setting your rhythms to that earlier cycle you may need for your work schedule. And then a few other things. Again, these are just a small proportion of tips that you can use. But you can avoid caffeine later in the day. And I will be honest, this is one that's harder for me. But caffeine in the morning is not bad because you're giving, again, your body that cue for it being active earlier on. So it sets those rhythms earlier. But if you have it later in the day, you start to delay those rhythms again. This next one is actually a big one. There are a lot of studies showing that blue light at night can start disrupting your rhythms. Now, what is blue light? You actually have blue light in a lot of different light sources you're exposed to. Sunlight, which shouldn't be a problem because the sun's light cycle we don't control. But computers, TVs, even some house lights, definitely cell phones and tablets all have blue light. So if you're looking at your cell phone or your tablet late at night, you're actually delaying or possibly disrupting your rhythms. Now, I will mention that there are phones. I know the Samsung Galaxy and the iPhones now have blue light filters within the settings. So you can actually try to filter out as much of the blue light as possible so you can look at your phone and hopefully not disrupt those rhythms. And if you have questions about those filters, feel free to ask me, send me an email. And then the last one here is getting that exposure to bright light after waking up. And there are some lights that you can purchase that have a good amount of blue light that you can get right away. You can just get on your phone or your tablet, and that may help right away in the morning setting your lights. And I have this picture down here. This is kind of a neat clock that has been released in the last few years, but it actually simulates sunrise. So you can set it for the time you want to wake up, and then it will start to bring the light on over a period of about 30 minutes to try to help facilitate you waking up and expose you to that light right away. So that's really what I have for you today. I wanted to kind of end with those tips for resetting your clock. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask those now, or like I said, feel free to email me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Brianna. I just a question. You mentioned earlier about you can kind of monitor your own chronotype and get a sense of if you didn't have to get up, if you allowed yourself to go to sleep when you wanted to go to sleep and get up without an alarm, you'd get a sense of what that is. And I'm wondering, what if our clock is already disrupted? How will we know what is sort of normal for us? Is that going to play out? How would we do that?
That is a great question. So if your clock is already disrupted and you are not arrhythmic, or you are not rhythmic, you are arrhythmic, then really you can't determine on your own what that normal chronotype is, because you won't have a normal sleep pattern on your what we call free days, where you don't have to wake up for anything or use an alarm clock. In that case, it's going to be very difficult for an individual to determine their rhythms themselves. What you could do is you can try to find a way to measure your body temperature. We have actually what's called in our lab an eye button. And it's just like a little disc that's about the size of a nickel that goes on your wrist. And they sell them for about $35 online. It's the software that's actually a little more expensive. But you wear them on your wrist and it tracks your temperature over time of day to see if you are rhythmic, and then you can actually determine your chronotype from there. That's a little bit more complicated because it requires a lot of things to be ordered and to come in the analysis. So if you are arrhythmic, if you are already disrupted, I would suggest talking to someone who is in the circadian rhythm field. The other thing that has come out more recently, and I haven't read too much into it because I just found out about this about 3 weeks ago, but some of these genetic testing sites like 23andMe have started adding preferred time of waking up into their analyses. And so I actually do have 23andMe, and it told me what my preferred wake up time was. And so I think they're trying to use some of the research that they're doing to start defining chronotype based on genetics.
Okay. Just got another question, and someone is asking, have any connections been found between circadian rhythms and autoimmune disease? And also, how does sleep apnea relate to this?
Yes, okay, so I will start with the first part of that, and that's a great question. I did not list that on the page where I was putting risks of circadian disruption down, but there are links between circadian rhythms and autoimmune diseases, in particular rheumatoid arthritis and osteoarthritis. There are a number of papers out there on that, showing that you are more at risk for developing these diseases. And if you're already predisposed to these diseases, if you have circadian disruption or you're experiencing chronic jet lag, you're more likely to develop symptoms earlier in life and develop worse symptoms. Now, with the sleep apnea component of the question, I'm not sure if disrupted circadian rhythms are linked to development of sleep apnea, but I do know that they have looked at individuals who have sleep apnea, and they typically have weakened circadian rhythms.
Okay, another question that popped in was, you talked about resetting circadian rhythms, and the person asked, is that advisable? Is there any positive or long-term effect on purposely resetting your natural rhythm?
So what we're looking at right now with the literature is that resetting the rhythms actually might seem to be beneficial if you are significantly off from your work week. So half an hour probably isn't too far off, but if you're more than an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours off of your work week and you're experiencing that chronic shift from week to week, from weekend to weekday, then right now the suggestion is to start shifting your rhythm. So start using exercise or activity in the morning, start changing your food patterns, to try to reset those rhythms, because it's much better for you long-term in terms of health. Now, it does take, I will mention, that it's not a quick thing where you start changing your feeding patterns and your exercise patterns and you'll see it in a week. This is more of a 2-3 week kind of transition where you're resetting your clocks daily. You're using these entrainment factors daily, and over that period of 2 or 3 weeks, you're going to start seeing that shift. It's like any lifestyle change, it takes some time.
Okay, I have another question just popped in. Our teen daughter likes to go to bed at 1 or 2 in the morning, then has to be up at 6 a.m. Then she wants to nap in the afternoon. Can resetting the clock help with this?
Entrainment factors can help with that. I'm actually not surprised that she prefers a later time. There are studies looking at younger populations and how circadian rhythms change throughout life. And what we typically see is that really young, when you're talking about elementary school age, we're looking at preferences towards waking up early. And then as you progress towards middle school and high school, the chronotype, that preference shifts to later and later times, which is part of the reason why there's been some discussion about when school times should start for elementary, middle school, and high school. One of the suggestions has been to move that high school start time a little bit later, but those entrainment factors, trying to reset the clock, could help your daughter start to move her clock more towards the timing for her school and make her hopefully feel overall better and be able to focus more in school, as well as put her at lower risk for potential health factors.
Okay. Any other questions from individuals? Feel free to put those in a text message. I would say, comment, you shared the alarm clock, the style that has the light. I have one of those and found it to be really useful, and it's a much more pleasant way to wake up in the morning. And I find that the light I just find it just brings me out of my sleep in the process. So I've enjoyed having one of those.
I believe some of them do sounds as well, like birds chirping.
It does, yes. You have the option of including that if you'd like. I don't think I'm going to pursue the dark chocolate piece, though, with my kids. That might be a little risky.
Yes, I have not tried that one either. I do like chocolate, but I'm not sure I want to try chocolate in the morning and get myself into that habit. Well,
I'm not seeing any other questions coming in right now, so I think we will go ahead and wrap things up. If people do have questions, Brianna, can they email you?
Absolutely. Feel free to email me. Or you can call my office phone. That's fine as well.
Wonderful. Well, I want to say thank you again, Brianna, for offering this. This was really fascinating information, really useful information. I've been hearing a lot about sleep cycles and circadian rhythms, and this really provided a much more comprehensive understanding of that. And so I hope others found it as interesting as I did, and really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule and being with us this afternoon.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for attending.
Okay, then we will share this recording with others after we get it processed and ready in an MP4 format. Thanks for joining us. If you do have suggestions for other webinars, please feel free to send those to us. Have a great day.